ICQ Podcast, episode 372, Amateur Radio Resources. Well, hello fellow amateur and radio enthusiasts, and welcome to this, our 372nd episode of the ICQ Amateur and Radio Podcast. Supported this episode by Walter Washburn, KT0 and Patrick Ange, Whiskey Mike 2 Alpha, along with our monthly and annual subscription donors. In this episode, Martin, M1LRB, is joined by Chris, Mike 0 Tango Charlie Hotel, Martin, Mike 0 Sierra Golf Lima, Frank, Kilo 4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel, and Leslie, Golf 0 Charlie India Bravo, to discuss latest amateur radio news. Myself, Colin, M6BOY, rounds up the news in brief, and this episode's feature is a feature looking at amateur radio resources. Well, as always, it's our very kind donors that keep your ICQ podcast show being produced, paying our way and keeping it advert free for you. So we'd like to thank Walt, KT0 who says thank you to Colin and all the ICQ podcast team, 73 to the worldwide ICQ amateur radio family from Walt in Colorado Springs. So thank you very much, Walt, for your very kind message and donation to our show. And he couples on with Patrick, Whiskey Mike 2 Alpha, as well as set up a subscription donor. Patrick's from New Jersey, and we really do appreciate their support for this episode of the ICQ podcast. As always, if you'd like to keep this show going and keep it advert free and show your support, it's a very simple method that we ask you to do. We ask you to think about the value you found from the show. Visit icqpodcast.com/donate. Turn that value into a monetary figure and then send it our way, and say everything you send is always greatly appreciated. Now let's join the guys as they discuss the latest amateur radio news. It's the team this week of Martin, Chris, Martin, Frank and Leslie, and they're going to be discussing news stories including an ham radio update from Ukraine and amateur radio ISS and STEM all working together. As always, hope you enjoy.
Well, hi guys, and welcome to this episode's News Roundtable for the ICQ podcast and episode 372. Tonight, I'm joined by Mr. Chris Howard, M0TCH. Hi, Chris.
Good evening, Martin. Oh, actually, I can't do that. It's on the episode, isn't it, this time? Sorry. Good evening, Martin. Good evening, guys.
Yeah, Leslie will get you one day for it, I tell you. We've also got Mr. Martin Rothwell, M0SGL.
What's up, homies?
I know you're not too well, are you?
Mate, I'm fine.
You all
I'm
right now?
I'm incredibly tired because my daughter woke us up at 5:15 this morning and I haven't slept yet. So I'm nodding off a little bit. I've also had 2 full days in the office, which haven't helped because I've been commuting into London. But I'm fine in myself, I think. But if I start talking absolute gibberish later, I apologise in advance. It's lack of sleep and not alcohol. Although I might have had a glass of Prosecco this evening.
Right. Well, I talk gibberish anyway, so that's no problems. Moving the other side of the pond, we got Mr. Frank Howell, K4FMH. Hi, Frank.
Hey, Martin, and I must say, of all the things I do every week, this is not number one, but it's really high up there.
Well, really
and I'm going to
high,
leave your imagination. And I'm going to leave your imagination in your own minds because this is a family show.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, you've got to look after Mrs. H. Because you know what? They come back to bite you if you don't. And I've already had the guys asking me if Mrs. B's going with us to the rally at the weekend. So that'll be interesting. Last but not least today, we've got Mr. Leslie Butterfield G0CIB. Hi, Leslie.
Good evening, Martin, and good to be back on again.
Yeah, great to have you, and it's going to be fun. Unfortunately, Mr. Bill Barnes, WC3B, can't make it tonight. One of his children's not very well, and it's snowing, so he's decided to duck out and go home to be with the family, which is the right thing to do, let's be honest about it. So, the 5 of us should keep you entertained for the next while. Okay, let's start the first news stories. Ukraine maintains ham radio silence in its state of emergency. Now, there's a lot going on out there, and, it's not just amateur radio, and I do feel sorry for the people who have lost lives and got injured. But, Chris, what's your thoughts on this whole situation?
Well, aside from amateur radio, it's a really terrible situation, out there at the minute. Really feel for the people that are affected by this. People's lives are torn apart. We've got, was it 1.5 million, 2 million refugees that have had to leave their homes and go elsewhere. So it's a very, very serious situation. So the news on this is that the local regulator in Ukraine has suspended all amateur radio licenses for 30 days. And I think that's quite sensible, because I think if you're operating a radio, you're probably a bit of a target. If you've got forces around you which aren't necessarily going to be, on your side, I think operating radio probably makes you a target. And a number of ways they can hear what you're saying. They can possibly DF where you are. They might wonder. They may not understand what amateur radio is. They might think you're some kind, communicating with who knows what, and they may decide to take it out on you. It's probably not a great idea to be on the air right now in that part of the world. However, saying that, I did actually hear a Ukrainian station on the air today around lunchtime. Now, he had a Ukrainian call sign, and he said he was near Kiev. Of course, I've no way of validating that, but that's certainly what he was saying, and I've no reason to sort of doubt that. But you always take that sort of with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But yeah, it's a really bad situation out there, and it's not. I suppose the other thing is this isn't the people themselves whose fault. Whether on either side, it's the leaders of those countries that are causing this to happen, and people are caught up in it are the ones that are suffering. So yeah, it's a real bad situation. I believe.
Yeah, not good at all. And I've got to say, if it was me transmitting out there, I wouldn't be using my call sign. I wouldn't want the reprisals. And there you go. Well, Leslie, you said they'd either listen to you or shove a missile through your roof, didn't you?
Well, what I was going to say was that, look, guys, just don't do it. It's a security risk. That's on one level. On another level, they can listen to what you're saying and put a picture together. Or the other one was the thing about the missile. Sure, it's not a good idea. I recommend they just put the equipment away, wait till this is over, till the leaders are around a table, bashing their heads out and come to some sort of, should we say, agreement, because nobody wants this, and the sooner it's finished, the better, in my view. And that's the way to go, to sit around a table. What else can I say? It's a human catastrophe at the moment, and I hope it finishes as soon as possible.
Yeah, I agree with you, Leslie. And all these things end up having to have discussions round table normally and thrashing it out. It's not as simple as the back in medieval times where your army marched in and you took over. So not good. Frank, is this affecting you guys in the States much at all?
Yes, certainly is. Maybe not so much as working DX, and it happens to be Ukraine. I have a number of long-term Ukrainian missionaries in my church, and I've gotten a lot of updates. In fact, one of them is in charge of Eastern Europe communications, and so he's up from 2 a.m. our local time to about 6, because that's down to the working day, and he's finding homes for refugees. Focusing on the amateur radio for a moment, as you just said, it's one thing to have some present day commercials where you've got some of the folks battling on the green, and they've got these little launchers where they would launch things, maybe filled with tar and it's fire, and they were trying to storm the castle. And today, all that's almost kind of entertainment just to watch, because nobody's really being killed and nobody's really being hurt. It's just something we watch on movies. Well, this is real. And I think about during the First World War, in which my grandfather, whom I was named for, fought in the Battle of Marne in France, and received mustard gas and was forever changed by that. He was a morphine addict. But there was no stigma to that. That's just how they treated what happened to your nerves where you got mustard gassed. Well, today, fighting is a lot more around communications. And I read a story that one of the things with the Russian troops is that they shelled the 3G towers Well, a lot of them had 3G cell phones to communicate with one another. So if their comms went off, you look at Ukraine and their military is more sophisticated on the ground than is Russia. So all the comms, not just for ham radio, but for actual warfare, as you alluded to, Martin, are incredibly important. And drones are involved, and those are controlled by radios and things like that. I remember in World War One, amateur radio was banned, and so was it in World War II, and there was a reason. And I think that we need to respect that when heads of states kind of ban that. We need to respect that and what it can represent. And we now have in the U.S. militia groups that stormed our Capitol on January 6th. And as you've heard me report that the Volunteer Monitor Program, along with Homeland Security, shut down 2 repeaters in the Washington, D.C. area. That's a very minor part of what could go on and is going on in Ukraine, a much more severe level. So it's a very important story. It's a very important issue. And the IARU is our international body, kind of like NATO is for Europe, to try to encourage agreement, cooperation, and doing what they define as the right thing. So with that soliloquy, I'll hand it back to you, Martin. But it's a terrible thing, and I think we hams need to cooperate and respect it.
I think you're right, Frank. I think you're right on that. Mr. Rothwell, what do you think?
Well, first of all, it goes without saying that, our thoughts are with our friends in Ukraine. I genuinely have no words to say. Just try and stay safe. I know it's easy for me to say that sitting here in the studio, but if you can, please do. There are a few people operating in Ukraine. We know that. We see it appearing on social media, people talking about it. As the other guys have said, it is potentially putting people at risk or putting yourself at risk if you're transmitting. You might make your location a target. There is that part of me that, if I'm listening around the bands and I hear someone from Ukraine, do I go back to them? Perhaps they're calling for help because comms have been taken out where they are. They need to get a message to a loved one or something like that, and they want someone to pass a message. Maybe then we could go back to them. But if it's just calling for contacts, for be that a contest, be that they're just playing with their radio and they need some entertainment, I don't want to be responsible for putting even one life at risk. So that is that part of me that says, do you know what? I don't think I can go back to them. I do have to say credit to one of the UK phone operators, British Telecom. They actually recently announced that calls to the Ukraine region are now free on all their networks, the mobile networks as well. So if you have relatives or friends out there and you're trying to reach them, just bear in mind that BT did announce that calls are free to them now, so that might be a way of doing it that is safer than perhaps amateur radio.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know about the BT one, but that's certainly a good one. Now, the second part of this news story that I picked up on is that the RSGB have put out a statement that says that the Russian Federation and Belarus aren't going to be able to take part in amateur radio contests because the amateur radio believe that the contests are sport, radio sport, and as sport, worldwide Russian athletes are banned. Now, I wouldn't suggest a radio operator is an athlete, and I struggle with the idea of sport, although I'm probably going to get ripped apart on this. But anybody else want to say anything on that, or you're going to hide for cover?
I've forgotten my gym kit.
Yeah, I know they call it radio sport. I don't really personally think it's in the same class as, Olympics, that sort of thing. It's a contest, it's a hobby, it's fun, but I think calling it, I don't know, like you say, a bit controversial. So a lot of people are going to think that's the wrong thing to say. I don't know. I personally don't think it's particularly a sport. But I think on the subject of the RSGB banning Russian, and I think they announced said something like they won't be allowed to enter into any contests managed by the RSGB. Any logs submitted will be considered a check log. Personally, I don't agree with that, because I don't think the people on the ground in Russia or Belarus, the individual people, are actually to blame for what's going on in that, in the Ukraine. It's the leaders of those countries that are, essentially causing this, not the individual people. And for me, amateur radio is about forming relationships. It's about international friendship. It's about the ethos is about a fellowship between people, across borders. So I think we should be encouraging people to talk to people other parts of the world, not discouraging it. So no, I'm personally not really in favour of this particular stance that's been taken.
Yeah, I would agree with you, actually, Chris. I mean, I did hear someone say that once on a YouTube channel, contesting on amateur radio is not for the faint-hearted. I mean, come on, you're not jumping out of a plane. I personally also don't see it as a sport, or at least not under the conventional term, that the way you would define a sport. I've heard lots of people talking about this. I've seen the comments on social media when the RSGB announced it, and people saying, perhaps it's, they're talking about severing ties with Russia. In that sense, I'm tending to agree with their decision to sever the ties with, the Russian thing. But at the same time, I think they've made a very, very big mistake, and I think they're wrong to be severing ties with the amateurs. If you're buying from Russian companies or whoever, that's fine, and you want to sever those ties, it's fine. But don't punish the amateurs for the actions of a few rotten eggs at the top. The amateurs are there; they're ordinary people. Most of them, I dare say, nearly all of them, probably don't agree with what's going on. Why should they be punished because of the behaviour of a few rotten eggs?
Yeah, Frank, what do you think on this one?
Well, I come at it, I'm a retired college professor, and part of my early career was spent studying sport. Taught a graduate course on it, taught an undergraduate course on it, published research on it, was on the editorial board of a Sociology of Sport journal. And, in everyday life, we all come up with definitions that we use. Well, to call it radio sport, okay, it promotes some stuff that the ARL does, that CQ Magazine does, that RSGB does, and a whole host of national organizations that I could spend the rest of the podcast listing, and all that's fine. It sells radios. K3LR is a big contester. He's got DX Engineering. ICOM is a big participant. So you can get on the business side and say, okay, it's a great promotion to call it a sport because that means it's important, but it does not meet any recognized definition of a sport. I used to challenge my classes to think about what we were studying. The only sport I participated in college was chess. The only reason I was on the chess team is because I worked at the student union, and the chess team would check out chess boards, okay? And I was the guy handing them out and taking their student ID. Well, there were 3 nationally ranked chess players. The coach was Ruben Chakran, who was a manager of a textile mill there in that town. He played Bobby Fischer to a draw in Buenos Aires in 1964. He was a pretty good chess player. Well, they needed a 4th. Well, I was standing thereby. So that was my role in being on the college chess team. I used to challenge my classes, tell me if chess is a sport or not. And the real answer is no, it's a game. And I think contesting is a game, not a sport. So the RSGB is, and like others, are in a quandary because they have certain social forces pushing them to take action. But what is the right action? And it's like choosing oranges or bananas. Whichever one you choose will be seen as not the right action by some. And I don't know what the right answer is. They've done what they've done. I understand what Martin Rothwell has said. I have sympathy with what he said. The individual shouldn't be blamed. QRZ.com took all Russian call signs out of their database for about 2 days until there was an uprising among their subscribers, and then they changed their minds. So, Martin, I know I've probably said a lot about nothing and made no real points, but that's my view on it.
No, your views are very important, Frank, and we're just discussing this through. Leslie, do you agree, disagree, or do you want to have the last words on this one?
I think some very valid points have been made. It used to be, and I did a bit of research on this one, that politics and religion were never discussed in amateur radio. I think it was about 1998. There were some changes in our licence, and they basically threw those rules out the window. Now, how does this sort of fit in with the RSGB thing? Well, I've been looking on social media, and if I was to do a straw poll, I would say 50% were for the decision and 50% against. And each side has very valid points. If the RSGB, and I'm a bit sympathetic, if the RSGB did nothing, they would be condemned. They've done something and they're still being pillared. And was this decision easy? I don't think it was at all. And I think their chins were probably on the table when they made it. They don't like getting involved in these types of things. The thing is, with this hobby, we was able to travel the world. We was to talk to people regardless of politics, regardless of their social background. It didn't matter. We could speak radio. And that was the great thing about this hobby. And unfortunately, due to circumstances, this is where we are at the moment. And I'm only going to reiterate, the sooner it's done, the better.
Yeah, agree with everything everybody said. And you are right, Leslie. At least the RSGB has made a decision. They've obviously discussed it. They've made a decision. You and I and the rest of the team might not agree with it, but I give them 10 out of 10 for making that a decision and not just doing nothing. So, can't always agree with people. I'm sure that people don't agree with us, but hey, they've made it. Let's move on to some lighter stuff now. Online training for ham radio exam in Spain. So now Spain's locked into doing this. Now, I think this could be interesting. Mr. Rothwell, what do you think?
Welcome aboard, Spain. That's what I can say. We know it works. This is something that we know works very, very well in the UK. It obviously took off here in particular at the start of lockdown because people found themselves with a lot more time on their hands. And those that always wanted to get their amateur radio exam or their amateur radio license suddenly found that they could. It might not work for everyone. We know that some people need to be taught face-to-face. You need to have hands-on training. Other people can absolutely lap up the information online, whichever way works for you. If your country is now offering this as a way of getting your license, I'm all for it. I don't have the figures to hand, but we know it worked very, very well in the UK. How it compares to how many people would have normally got their license, I should imagine it is exponentially higher. So welcome aboard, Spain. Are they doing the exams online as well, or do you still have to go to an exam centre? Either way, it's only a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with you, Martin. No problems at all on that one. Frank, what's your thoughts on Spain doing online training?
I think they have taken a step in the right direction. I'll have to confess a great deal of ignorance. I know that one of our sometimes appearing team members, Matt, was in Spain for a while, and I would listen. He was on the other team, and I would listen to some of his comments. I don't know much about amateur radio in Spain, but I do think this is a great step forward. And as Martin Rothwell said, I think, we have this moment, and while COVID is not truly over, it has subsided a great deal in many places, and many of the regulations have softened. So that moment when you've got some time, it's a wonderful time to introduce amateur radio to people, and doing it remotely is just a great deal. And really, the folks in England, you guys have just led the way with this. You've had fantastic success with this. So I think it's just a great, great step forward for Spain.
Yeah, I certainly do. Leslie, thoughts on this one?
Just rewind the clock back 30 years and you can just imagine the discussion at the radio clubs. No, this will never work, Leslie. We don't do things like that. You've got to stick with things like Morse code.
Yeah.
Look, it's been an overwhelming success in this country. Great. I mean, I take lots of little courses on various subjects online. It doesn't cost me very much at all. And I'm going to reiterate it. Welcome, Spain. This is a good thing. Run with it. It works.
Certainly does. Certainly does. Last words on this one, Chris?
Well, absolutely. I think the RSGB here in the UK have led the way with this, and I think it's been incredibly successful. I think in part due to lockdown and people got, not being able to attend clubs, that sort of thing. Not just RHB, we've got Essex Ham. They've been hugely successful in getting people.
Yes, we must mention Essex Ham. They're great.
Yep.
Hugely successful at getting people through their exams. I'm just looking on the website now. It's in Spanish, but Google Translate's doing a pretty good job of translating it into English. But I think the exam, I'm not certain about this, but I think the exam is still done in person, but the training is online, and I think that's a great thing. And yeah, hopefully it will, say here in the UK, it seems to really take off. The number of people getting licensed during lockdown, doing the online exam, to be fair, was massively more than normal. So, I think this is a really good thing, and hopefully we'll hear a lot more of our Spanish colleagues on the air soon.
Well, I think online training has been positive. There are people that would find it much easier. Now, you guys haven't seen this, but I will mention it. There is some feedback that Colin and I are doing 73s regarding what another amateur found. And I found this as well. This is due to the fact that we all, and I emphasize all, need to be more tolerant to new licensees, to help them, to take them through. They will be tongue-tied. They will be having all sorts of problems. But if we don't help them, they're shy. I mean, a classic example, yesterday, the day before we record, Phil, VK6 ADF, was operating as VK80LAN, the Lancaster Bomber Special Event Station in Australia. And he decided to do it on D-Star. But not just D-Star. He said, Mike, can I use the talk group? And I said, of course you can. Fill your boots. And he did it on the ICQ podcast talk group. I saw an M7 from the log later in the day. Had just blipped the talk group. And then obviously got overwhelmed and didn't go any further. So I think we do have to help these people, and don't make it so frightening for them, and cut them a bit of slack, and then offer to help. Anyway, that's my high horse, and it's down to every one of us. All right, let's move to the next news story. Amateur radio, ISS, and STEM. Well, that's, I think, a really, really good combination. Now, I'm going to pass this to Frank first. Frank, what do you think?
We've talked about a number of, I'll call them satellite stories, because there's a satellite in there somewhere. And I will say this, there's not been one single time that when I mention, for whatever reason, that I'm an amateur radio operator, whatever the response, oh, y'all still do that? Or, oh, you must be a weird guy. Or whatever the response, oh, that's interesting. When I say that we talk to the International Space Station, whether they're old like I am or very young, it's always, wow, that's really cool. So taking that linkage and putting it into schools, of which STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math, some schools call it STEAM, STEAM, because they put arts there as well. Doing that is just brilliant. And I'm just delighted. This Robert Keim. I read some of his articles in general. He's done some other stuff in All About Circuits, and I'll leave it to the other presenters to kind of finish up. But I am bullish on things like this, Martin.
Yeah, well, I think it's just exciting times for youngsters. I mean, come on, they might not have heard of amateur radio, but they've certainly heard of the ISS. They're probably in the STEM projects at school.
Martin, I was in something called Project Talent here in the U.S., and it was after the Sputnik scare, since we're talking a lot about Russia today. So the U.S. responded with a program, hey, we've got to improve our talent. So they had Project Talent. Well, I was one of the several million kids picked by test scores in the first grade. I got shown a Geiger counter in the fourth grade, and I think I may have wet my pants when I saw a Geiger counter. So you run that forward to talking to satellites, and we got to invest in more underwear for kids in schools.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing all round. Chris, what's your thoughts?
Absolutely. We've had a number of years now where the ISS has been contacting schools and other youth groups and really inspiring people to get involved in a number of things, particularly around, STEM related. In fact, I'm just looking at the website for NASA there, and it talks about STEM and the ISS and mentions amateur radio and using it to communicate with astronauts and cosmonauts that are up there. And it really is inspirational. And if it inspires kids to get involved in science and technology, etc., then I think that's an excellent thing. It only takes, I know that when this happens, it's kids of various different ages that do it, and it takes a lot of organising. And I know ARIS spend a lot of time helping schools to achieve this, to be able to communicate directly with astronauts. But it's got to be pretty cool to be able to, as a kid, talk to someone that's overhead, travelling at 18,000 miles an hour, up in space. That's got to be pretty special, and it's certainly something I think they'll remember for the rest of their lives. And if that inspires them to want to get involved in something like technical, as a career or something, I think that's a great thing. Or even to get involved in radio communications.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, all right. Frank and I were around at the very beginnings of the space race and remember things like Sputnik and that, and the moon landings and all those sort of things. But we never ever were able to participate as such. But Martin, what's your thoughts?
Well, Frank just mentioned a moment ago talking to someone about the possibility of talking to the space station and the response being, wow, that's cool. I had that exact conversation with someone 2 weeks ago, if that. Basically, he saw the antenna on my car. In fact, we were out in the car. We were going to go into a multi-storey car park, and I had to get out and pull the antenna down because it's obviously quite high. Wouldn't fit into the car park, and he was asking loads of questions about it, and he sort of said, "Is that CB?" And I'm like, well, it's like CB on steroids. And oh, it's ham then. So he actually knew a little bit about it. He didn't know much about it, but he knew a little bit. And he said, "Oh, so can you talk to, like, how far can you talk?" And I'm like, well, you can talk to the other side of the world with, a little bit more power than a standard domestic light bulb. And he said, do you reckon you could ever get further than that? Well, what about the International Space Station or bouncing signals off the moon? And he was absolutely hooked and fascinated. We could have chatted about this for absolutely hours. And the thing is, he's been to my house several times, never noticed the antennas on the roof. But I think probably the next time he comes around, he'll probably be asking a lot more questions about the kit and probably want a demonstration. And, talking about things like the digital talk group and stuff, his mind was blown. But, in this sort of thing, students communicating with the ISS, I remember as a kid, the magic of radio for me, and this invisible technology was absolutely fascinating. Had I seen people talking to the ISS as a youngster, I would have been blown away. It's nice to see, I say analog, because, okay, it is analog, but we also have digital technologies. It's nice to see the more old-fashioned, is probably the wrong word, technology, or the more experienced or more mature technology being promoted alongside the modern stuff that is Arduinos and, and little circuit boards, let's put it that way.
Certainly is. And as I say, I would have had my mind blown years ago if I hadn't have been the sort of technical type person and interested in this stuff all the way through. But, I've told the story of the school I went to, the secondary school. They had an oscilloscope, and everybody got it out on open day. And for the first year I was there, nobody switched it on. The second year I switched it on. It actually had a line across the middle. The third year, because it was the last 3 years at school, I went to that school. But the third year I was there, I actually got the scope probe and fitted it to the calibration square wave and had a square wave up. And the science master thought I was absolutely brilliant. He didn't know how to use an oscilloscope, but they just got one because, it looked good at open days. But this stuff's phenomenal. Leslie, what's your thoughts?
I've just got a big grin on my face. I know they do this at Gilwell Park when the ISS went over there, and I was listening to it on my handheld, and I had a very good idea what was going on. And the word I would use was be inspirational. That's a great word. And I know it was used several times previously. There's only one problem, though, is that once they catch the bug, they can't be cured. You do realise that, guys?
You've been watching Dilbert. Oh no, he'll be an engineer.
That's the
Yeah.
one.
Once they got the knack, yes.
He used
The
components
television
to build a
starts
ham
coming
radio
apart.
set.
Yeah, but good show. And I did have a look at the website and the setup they got. I was very, very jealous of the radio from NXP, company called NXP. And they had a superb radio wagon with this great pump-up mast. And I was very, very jealous of the way they're set up, because we haven't got that in our club. So big grin from here.
Certainly is. And I say, lots of nice stories like once we pass Ukraine, and we do worry about the Ukraine, as we said. Next one, successful QO100 ham radio emergency communication. Now, that's through the geostationary satellite that covers about a third of the world. So, I'm quite impressed that we could do that. Frank, I know that unfortunately the States are not covered by this satellite, but if you had something similar for races or areas, that might work very well for you guys.
Oh, it would be just a godsend for MCOM in particular, Martin. But, there's an upside to us not having access to QO100. It's motivation to get one. And I think that's a very good thing. But looking at this story, I think it underlies what the IARU, while we sometimes criticize them, as we talked about in a previous study, RSGB was damned if they did and damned if they didn't. But IARU does a number of things very well, and coordinating these kinds of activities is certainly one of them. So just the notion, here in the States, I've got a number of friends, even here in the Jackson metropolitan capital city area, they're out in what we would call rural landscapes, even though they're in the metropolitan area, i.e., their internet is terrible. And so the Tesla Starlink program is a possibility. I've got a friend in 5 Delta uniform who's on my portable ops team, and he is the state RACES officer, Martin. He's waiting for his Starlink equipment to arrive. Now, all that is to say that just like Starlink giving folks out in the rural areas internet, if we had the equivalent of a QO100 here that covered the states, I think it would be very quickly adopted and would be a tremendous, tremendous benefit. Imagine some of what the local mesh technology, now called Aridon, would be if there were links through satellites back to Homeland Security, to wherever it would be, that you would have a hard time doing because your area internet might be down. Anyway, I could go on. Very, very impressed with this, and this is a terrific story. Another success for IARU in my book.
Certainly seems it, Frank. Certainly seems it. Chris, what's your thoughts?
Absolutely. I can see how satellite-based communication, and particularly because this is geostationary and therefore can provide that reliable, always there communications, being really, really useful in an emergency. And also the fact that we know that with HF we can transmit over long distances, but there's no guarantee. We know that we depend on conditions. There's no guarantee that I can always talk to somebody in Germany or in Austria or whatever, because that's just really down to potluck and what's happening with conditions. With this satellite, because it's always there in the same place in the sky over our heads, we know that we can probably have, so I suppose it might break down or something. I don't know how, I don't think it has yet, but, we know that we've got a much better chance of being able to make contact via this than we would do if we want to make a specific contact to a particular place. This is going to be the place to do it, because it's going to have, it's the first time we've got a thing up in space, the repeater up in, above all of our heads. It's always there, that can reach us such a massively wide area. So, what's a repeater? I mean, also mean transponder, but essentially, it's a reliable way of communicating over a vast area. The low Earth orbit satellites, which are out there, which are also could be useful, but not as useful because they are only there for a short amount of time. They only, a pass lasts a few minutes as it's passing over our part of the world, whereas with this, it's always there. So I can see this having huge potential in emergency situations. And doing a test, I think, is a really good idea to really test out that theory.
Yeah, well, I think it covers best part of a third of the world, this satellite. So, yeah, pretty good one. Leslie, thoughts on this one?
Well, I've just been looking at the coverage, Martin. It's an area covered from South Africa to the UK, which is, as I've travelled that distance, I have an appreciation of the vastness. So the thing is, what they're doing here, it's an exercise, and you want things to go wrong in an exercise. I'd say that way we learn things from them. Yeah, okay, it was a success. But the more real you can make the situation, and then you can sort of say, yeah, we'd change this or we'd make this better. And it appears to me to be a very, very useful tool in the toolbox. Like you were saying earlier, that we can use HF and use other systems, and this is another system we can use. And I think it's going to be very useful indeed.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be, Leslie. Right, mine. Last words on this one?
The only thing I can say is it's unfortunate that it's not just you can operate with a single black box. You've got to do a little bit more effort to use this. But I can say once again, amateur radio potentially to the rescue. Put that in your cellular network, police-based radio system. Amateur radio for the win.
Certainly is, and well, it's a good exercise. Right, there's a note here: the FCC to consider radio receivers. Then they're talking about a notice of inquiry in April. So, Chris, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, so this one is, I think, in relation to a previous story that we covered, which is about 5G, and it's in the States, the potential impact on aircraft and a real concern. I think there was an agreement made where the 5G service wouldn't be turned on in certain areas near to big airports because of this concern. And it relates to radio altimeters that aircraft use when they come into land. So it's an accurate way to get a measurement above the ground, the Earth's surface, so that the avionics on board the aircraft can land the plane essentially, or help to land the plane. I know that a lot of autoland systems rely on the radio altimeter. So the concern was that the frequencies used by the 5G service were fairly close to the frequencies used by these radio altimeters. This is really talking about the kind of, well, actually, maybe it's not the fault of the 5G service. Maybe it's actually the fault of the people designing these altimeters. Perhaps they're not as selective as they need to be. And in fact, this article talks about the frequencies used by the altimeters between 4.2 and 4.4 gigahertz. And the 5G service is usually between 3.7 and 3.98 gigahertz, which is actually fairly far apart. And what they're saying is really that should those altimeters be built to a higher standard to be more immune to these 5G signals. So it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of, there's always two parts to any EMC type story. One is the transmitter, the thing that's causing the interference, and the other is the receiver and how immune it is to interference. And this is looking at the immunity of receivers. And it may well be that when these altimeters were designed many years ago, that there wasn't anything anywhere near them, and therefore they didn't need to be as selective. But clearly, we're now in a new world, and there are signals that are nearer to the frequencies they operate on, and perhaps those need a bit of filtering or something applied to them to make them a bit more immune to these types of signals.
Yeah, I like your analogy of maybe there wasn't anything around at the time, Chris, therefore they didn't have to bother too much. Although I would guess with aircraft stuff you would try and do your best. But I suppose it's a bit like car entry systems. They're down at about 143 something or other. Wide open as a barn door. If you transmit with your 1 watt handy-talkie on 433, for argument's sake, people won't be able to get into their cars. And and that happens. I've seen it, and I've seen automatic, hoods going up and down, all sorts of things happening. So there you go. Martin,
Is that why you sit in the car park often with your 70 Sems handheld?
Oh, would I? Yeah, Martin, what's your thoughts?
That's the daft thing. I mean, I'm licensed to run 400 watts on 433.92, and I'm allowed to be there, yet the license-exempt people are the people that get Ofcom and things coming out to look at it. I just don't get it. And I had a whole load of things to say. It's interesting that, when something, is happening on the ground, a lot of things, people don't care, irrespective of the damage things are causing. But when it's interfering with potentially with people's lives in a plane, they jump. Yes, it's right, they jump to fix things that are potentially life-threatening. But when they're not doing that, why are they not looking at things that are happening on the ground? Classic example, PLT. We know it's an issue, but they still permit it. But there is one thing that I will come to, and I wonder if this has anything to do with like these aircraft altimeters and things. There's a lot of devices, and I haven't got one to hand that I can read the exact wording out of, but I know I've got it on loads of devices, and it's an FCC rule, and it's something along the lines of, this device must not cause interference to anything. However, this device must accept interference, including interference that causes undesirable operation.
That's part 15, Martin.
Is a ridiculously stupid clause. Why? Have a look.
That's called part 15 in the federal regs.
But why? It's a stupid rule. And, what are you trying... I don't want this thing to get interference with. Have a look on these things that are apparently being interfered with by 5G. Is that written on there? Because perhaps FCC, it's time to change that rule.
I think, Frank, you should answer that one.
Go on.
Well,
I'd be willing to listen.
That's part 15. And now, let me say this. It's very good for amateurs. Why? We operate under Part 97. We have a license to transmit. So technically, your neighbor who's got the plasma TV is violating Part 15 regulations when they interfere with your Part 97 amateur radio. Well, the ARL and general principles of good decorum and nice behavior suggest that's not your leading argument to your neighbor. You ought to try to work with them. So, Martin, I don't know where that came from. I wasn't engaged on, that rulemaking. I do have a comment about the more general story, Martin, if that's if that's appropriate. We covered this previously, and it was a bit of some sword tilting, if you will, between or among the big cellular industry. Lots of money, billions and billions of dollars, okay? Shooting things up into space and, for that, and all that stuff is just blowing and going, selling off old TV bandwidth, bringing in lots of money to the FCC. But the FAA, who has regulatory authority over air travel, including drones, which are radio-based, etc., you begin to see the little overlapping Venn diagram of both legal jurisdiction and authority and financial interest. I interpret this story by looking at the way FCC does business. When they do an NOI, notice of intent, there's two things going on. There's a bureaucratic rule to say, hey, we want to let you know we intend to do X, Y, and Z. Then what will come is a period of comment. So they'll gather official comment. Now, most of the time, they already know the end of the story, but they're just letting people know they're getting there. I interpret this as the new chairwoman, Rosensell, whom I'm very impressed with thus far, is letting folks know you need to clean up your act because we will eventually come up with standards that you must adhere to, or you won't get the sticker that we require being put on there. Kind of like that sticker, Martin, that you feel like is stupid. And I agree. I've wondered about the wording myself, but that's coming, and that's the FCC's way of reasserting its authority into the marketplace. At least that's my take on it, Martin.
Well, that's a good take on it, Frank. That's a good take. Leslie, go on. What's your thoughts?
Oh, I've been listening with interest. There was a book, a very old book, on the subject of EMC by a guy called Bembo. Don't know if you remember it, Martin. Do you recall it?
I've heard of Bembo, but not that particular book, but I have read some of his books.
And I think it had this a very technical book, and there was one sentence, and it said that the most important thing was diplomacy with your neighbour. And it's the one thing that really, really matters. And I'd like to use to take up on Frank's point. The analogy that I would use was, imagine you've got a roof and it's pouring, and on the roof it's got a nice hole in it, and it's pouring down with rain, and you're looking up and blaming the rain. No, it's because you've got a hole in the roof. And this is what they're saying with the receivers. The receivers are simply not built to a standard, and they're looking at things in a different way. Anyway, that's very, very interesting, Frank. And over to you, Martin.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good one, and probably receivers need to be cleaned up a bit. Everybody worries about transmitters, but maybe we need to improve our receivers even more.
I think so.
Yeah. Right, last news story, because we're going a bit long this one, but hey, we got the time. Workshop for amateur radio operators working to enhance science. Now, we've kind of covered this half this story before, but it's still important to keep it in our mindset. And it's your side of the pond, Frank, so I'm going to go with you again first on this one.
Well, this we talked about it before, so I'll be very brief on that regard. This is a workshop that is part of the Ham Radio Science Citizen Investigation Program, or HAMSCI. And it's led by a young faculty member at the University of Scranton, up near Bill Barnes, QTH, there in Pennsylvania, Dr. Nathan Frissell. And this is now in its fifth year to have this annual workshop. And young Nathaniel, I'm just enamored with him. He's just a tremendous young scientist and scholar. And the punchline to me of this workshop, and listeners and other presenters will comment on it, I'm sure, we're going to talk about different things that contribute to our understanding. But I want our listeners to follow along. Many use Whisper. Many use the Reverse Beacon Network. Many use PSK Reporter. Some just get on FT8 and see where their signal's being heard to try to do an empirical assessment of the ionosphere and guess about our propagation. The HAMSCI project, called the Personal Space Weather Station, is a team-driven project working with Tapper out in Tucson, Arizona, to create a box with antennas that will be a personal space weather station. And when that is done, I think it will be at least as visible and important as our friend Hans Sommer's Whisper Beacon, because it's going to allow hams at their location to collect propagation or space weather in the broader terms. What impact of space flares, can measure some of those things, and it will go back into a consolidated database. Get your rain gear out, fellow hams, because it's going to be a deluge of data in a couple of years when that hit. And that's the theme, is the weather connection. Keep your eyes on that Personal Space Weather Station team. They meet every week by Zoom, in increasing what they're doing with that. Exciting times, Martin. If you guys get over here for Hamvention, if you fly through Atlanta, I'll meet you over in Huntsville, and I'll try to organize a tour. It's an amazing place.
Yeah, it certainly sounds it, Frank, and very much like to do that. And understanding space weather and being able to predict it a lot better is going to be a great tool for our arsenal for ham radio. I'm sure of that one. Martin, what's your thoughts?
I'll be honest, I don't have much to say on this one, but it's including amateurs. Awesome. I'm just very excited to learn more and see where this goes.
Yeah. Well, it's something that, it's another area of amateur radio and working with science and developing things, which I think is great news. Leslie, thoughts on this one?
It sounds absolutely great, Martin, and I look forward to learning more.
Yeah. Well, as I say, not a lot we can comment on this. Frank knows more about it than most of us. Chris, last words on this one?
Yeah, it looks really interesting. I see that one of the speakers is Jim Bacon, who's an ex-BBC weather presenter, and I believe he's spoken before at some of the RSGB events. I think he's also a radio amateur as well, so he's got a talk on influences of terrestrial weather on radio propagation and the ionosphere. So that this all sounds incredibly good. And yeah, as kind of the other guys were saying, this is going to be really good for pushing forward amateur radio and science together.
Well, I thought you were going to mention, I think it was Michael Fish back in the 80s, there will be no hurricane.
Well, we can't blame Jim for that one, but yes.
Yeah, the poor guy stood on national television, said there'll be no hurricane, and probably 50% of the trees in England were down the next morning.
And the BBC's power supply.
And Seven Oak become One Oak.
Yeah, it really was. But yeah. But great news, great things happening, which I'm really pleased about. Okay, let's find out what you guys have been up to since the last time we had a chat. Let's work across the table. Chris, what have you been up to?
I bought a new radio. I bought a Yaesu FT3, which is the handheld. Their kind of, was their flag. It's not a brand new one. This is a used one bought from a dealer. But the flagship, their new flagship radio is the FT5D. This is the slightly older one. I don't know what happened to the FT4. It went from the FT1, the FT2, the FT3, then went to the FT5, and I've got the FT3, which is a very nice radio. It's got touch screen, it's got a colour display, it does system fusion, and works really well. It's got built-in APRS, built-in GPS. So I've been learning that. It's quite a lot to learn. It does quite a lot. I've been using it on the talk group for using the hotspot that I've got for system fusion. I have to say, my other Yaesu handheld for system fusion, which is the FT70, this is a different experience altogether. The touch screen, etc. So with this, you can actually get a list of all the talk groups and just press on it on the screen and connect, rather than the FT70 you have to know the talk. Oh, sorry, not the talk group, the room's number, and type it in to connect. So this is a bit more user friendly. Battery life seems pretty good, and I've been playing with the APRS, and that works pretty well as well. So for both sending and receiving signals, so quite impressive. Not a cheap radio, not a cheap handheld, but certainly from what I've played with it so far, it's pretty impressive. And I actually used it yesterday. I know Martin, you did the same thing, and I think you mentioned it earlier. Phil VK6 ADF, have I got that right, or was it VK4? Apologies, Phil, I forgot your call sign wrong. I'm sure Martin will correct
me. He's a 6. Whatever you do not call Phil a VK4.
So I was right the first time. So Phil VK6 ADF was running the Lancaster Bomber Special Event Station from Australia yesterday, and he, as you were saying, he was on the ICQ podcast talk group, and I worked him through this new radio, so that worked pretty well. And so that's what I've been up to. In terms of things coming up, I am planning to be at Hamzilla on the ICQ podcast stands this weekend. So I think that's the day this comes out. So if you happen to hear this really early in the morning, we might see you at Hamzilla.
Yeah, it's unfortunately it is going to be. We will be at Hamzilla the morning this gets released, and I've already spoke to Andy this morning from Ham, who's putting on the event, and it's looking to be a big one. So if you're still thinking of coming late morning, I don't think you'll be disappointed if you tip up late morning either.
I am looking forward to going to my first rally in, it's got to be over sort of 2.5 years. So this will be great, hopefully.
Yes, that'll be a good one, mate. That'll be a good one. Martin, what have you been up to since we last talked?
Well, we last spoke about an hour ago. Well, just a comment on what Chris said. FT3, the fact they didn't have an FT4. Maybe there won't be an FT8 or an FT8 call. I wonder if they're trying to avoid
very
confusion
good.
between the Joe Taylor modes.
Yes.
Because otherwise
Very good
someone
point,
might come
actually.
along, why doesn't it do that? Just a theory. I don't know that for sure,
Never thought
but
of that.
there might be
Very
some
good point.
confusion. What have I been doing? Mostly playing with a talk group. I mentioned to you, Martin, the other day, I've been having an issue with my little MMDVM Pi-Star hotspot, the low-power one. Seems to drop when I'm using Fusion after around 30 seconds. Talking away and it goes, and I lose it. You mentioned you know what, or you think you know what that issue might be. I'll have to talk to you off air and we can have a little conversation and see if there's a setting, but it is weird. I can listen for as long as it like. It will transmit for as long as you like, but as soon as I start talking back to it, it just drops. So that's something I was playing with and trying to get my head around that, but hopefully we can get that sorted at some point. Started pulling some cables, as I mentioned. I had to dismantle my shack because my daughter needs that bedroom and all the cables and stuff still come into that bedroom, so I've started pulling them back, but it was cold and raining and I was balanced on a ladder that wasn't very safe, and so I stopped doing it, and I was going to wait for it to warm up a little bit before I started pulling any more. The Heliax is going to be fun because that goes up through the loft, and I've since insulated the loft, so I'm going to have to crawl under the insulation material to get that out. But we will get there. Either way, started that, so that's a project that's ongoing, and hopefully at some point I'll be able to plug the radios back in. What I did do, though, was I modified an ICOM repeater unit to house some Motorola hardware. So whereas I had the Motorola staff and a Raspberry Pi and a couple of other bits and pieces just all precariously balanced on the edge of a table, it's now in a nice metal box and looks very, very neat in the corner of the room. And my wife doesn't seem to be that worried about it sitting there anymore. She's quite happy with it. Fan's a bit noisy, so I'll have to change that. But otherwise, all good. And that is pretty much what I've been doing on the radio.
Yeah, well, it sounds like fun. Sounds like fun. And I know you've been pretty busy on the talk group as well. Yeah, we do talk. Us presenters use the talk group as much as anybody else. It's there for everybody.
But everyone is welcome to join us. If you hear us chatting, come in and say hello.
Yeah. Certainly do that.
We don't bite much. And only when I'm hungry. And I said sorry.
Yeah. Well, no. You start off by having the right strop when you're hungry, and then you
just feed me. It's fine.
Yeah, we have to feed you quick. But yeah, I remember this. Sorry, this is a little giggle, but I remember being at National Hem Fest one day, one Saturday, and they had a bar, and there was a barmaid there, and it was starting to thin out a bit. And I think it was you, but it could have been Chris, because you're both equally as bad when you're hungry. We're starting to lose it, and Colin walked up to you and give you, both of you, a Sneakers bar. And the barmaid went, "What's that all about?" I said, "If we don't feed them, they get very aggressive." Oh, dear. Anyway, there you go. Leslie, what have you been up to?
Well, I'm going to come back to that. We don't call them Snickers. We call them marathons, Martin. Or am I showing my age?
You're showing your age.
And at the bottom it used to say internationally known as Snickers. Can I just say, in the interest of being impartial, other brands of chocolate bars or candy bars are available.
We didn't get paid for that. Anyway, yes, I've had a rather enforced absence, Martin. You know what it was, but I'm not going to go to it on the air. I'm now my usual self. And so getting back into amateur radio again. But it was only for a couple of weeks, but great to be back again. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, great to have you back, mate. And I did wonder when I sent the reply out, I've been meaning to contact you for the last week, and I just don't know where the time goes. So never feel that I'm not interested. Just kick the old devil because he hasn't made it in time. That's all I'm going to say. Frank, what have you been up to?
Well, I'm glad to know that Leslie's kind of back in the saddle, as we might say, here in the States. And need to know, Chris, did you ever finish that box of Snickers that I gave you when you came over to Hamfetch?
Oh, I'm sure that was eaten many years ago, Frank, to be fair.
Well, let just know that I'll have another box for you if you make it back over. So, Martin, I've been not as busy as some other episodes. Spring cleaning with pressure washing, cleaning windows, and doing the kind of things that the chief of staff in my house tells me I need to do or it's time to do. Spend a good bit of time doing that. The other thing in the ham radio I've been involved with is trying to finish this paper that I mentioned in the last episode on the cusp of a scientific revolution involving our understanding of the solar sunspot cycle with Dr. Scott McIntosh out in Colorado. I've learned an awful lot from him. It's outside of my field of science, but I've learned an awful lot about what he and his team have put together with their very positive forecast of cycle 25. And as we can see from the sunspot counts, his team's predictions are a lot closer to what we are observing than are the official predictions. So I've just gotten that finished in the last day or two, trying to improve a couple of graphics that are just a little too grainy. And Radcom has expressed an interest, and we're about to get that off to them. And we'll see if they publish it. If they don't, we'll probably publish it somewhere else. But I've been finishing that and learning quite a bit about that. And I think when that's done, our listeners will find that to be something really worth reading, because his team now has a model that can forecast the number of sunspots as well as the 10.7 centimeter, the SFI index. And we have that in this paper, a forecast for the entire cycle 25 for the solar flux index. So that's taken up a lot of my time. The other part on amateur radio is working in my workbench area. I'm kind of cycling out some equipment. I'm selling an old Tektronix 496 spectrum analyzer to a friend, a ham, who is a partner in our link repeater system. Getting that to him. He doesn't have a spectrum analyzer. So getting that out, and that's freed up a lot of space. I finally got the new Siglent spectrum analyzer that I purchased about a year ago out of the box and on my IT rack. Doing a little carpentry to build a cubby hole. Some of our listeners probably are familiar with some of the products for your test bench out of China that are designed by the Chinese ham, whose call sign is BG7TBL. And I picked up a small signal generator, goes up to about 4.5 gigahertz, and already had one of his counters that goes up into the 4 gigahertz range. Now I don't really do microwave stuff, but at the price point and with the other equipment that I have, which I've got some HP counters that are professional quality and things like that, it's just too tempting. So I built a little cubby hole that goes under a riser on my workbench that will house a number of these types of test gear, such as the Digilent, AD2, the SDR kits, VNA, and some other things, the Tiny SA. And they all connect by USB to my PC. So I've been doing what I've told my wife I've spent half my life doing, crawling around under tables, hooking up wires. So that's been pretty much what I've been doing the last couple of weeks, Martin.
Yeah, well, it sounds so you've been enjoying yourself anyway, Frank, and that's the most important thing. Well, what have I been up to? Well, not a tremendous amount radio-wise, but let's give you some updates. Did work the VK80LAN, as Chris did. We worked Phil in the ICQ podcast talk group for the special event station for the Lancaster bomber, the 80 years since the first sortie. So I did work that one. I have done a reasonable amount of VHF and UHF locally, including rattling Mr. Rothwell's repeater a few times. And looking at the stats for the talk group, we're well down this last month on connections. We haven't had as many connections through, and I attribute this to people going back to work now. They're no longer at home during the day. Things have got a little bit quieter, but there's still over 2,000 connections last month. And the good news is we've now got 42 countries in the log that have connected to us. The latest one was China. I had an amateur in China that connected to the ICQ podcast talk group. And Yeah, so 11 new users, new call signs, 1 new country. I'm still quite pleased about that. Off of amateur radio, but still radio, some time ago I got a Bush TR-80 receiver. Now, this is a broadcast receiver, medium wave and long wave. You guys must have seen them in the States because they've made so many variants of these. You know, they all pretty much look very similar, but there's so many variants. But the one I've got is a 1959 model, and the first ones that came out in 1958 actually had miniature valves in them, and it was built valve technology. The 1959 one, they went over to germanium transistors, but they built it point-to-point wiring like a valve radio. So although it's got transistors in it, it's no printed circuit board. It's all built point-to-point wiring. So I'd had one, fixed it, but I needed a tuning knob for it, and they're a very specialised tuning knob. And Monday night, one of the club members, Phil, came in and said, "Hey, Martin, I got one of those for you." So that's now complete. I'm going to give the case a good spruce up, and I'm not going to let that one go. It's such an iconic radio, and it's a very early one. There can't be many of these about, so I'm quite pleased with that. As Chris said, we'll be at Hamzilla. If you didn't make it, it's your own fault. But listen out, because Andy's putting another one on, I think he said the 31st of July in Ashford in Kent. They're going to have the Grand Day Out again. And I enjoyed doing that one last year. It won't be a big rally like Hamzilla, but still worth going. And just a little bit of news that I spotted. Colin from DX Commander, there's notices on YouTube saying that Cullum's channel's been taken down. He doesn't know why. I don't know why. I'm not being political on this one or judgmental, but Cullum's YouTube channel's been shut down. He's in the process of trying to get it back, and he's also in the process of setting up a new YouTube channel. So if any of you wanted to see some DX Commander stuff on YouTube, you might not find it at the moment. And last but not least, my Balfang DM1801 has been to the club a couple of times, and I've shown people up there and taken them through some of the things that the OpenGD77 software does. And people are saying, "But it does all that in that little radio." I went, "Yeah." And I said, "But it's the software upgrade, the free software that we've covered on the podcast, that makes such a big difference." Right, so that's what I've been up to. All I'm going to do now is thank the boys for joining me tonight, and then I'm going to move on with the podcast. I'd like to thank Mr. Chris Howard, M0TCH.
Thank you, Martin. Cheers, guys. Another fun episode.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Mr. Martin Rothwell, M0SGL.
It's been fun as always.
Yeah, you didn't get me into too much trouble tonight, I don't think.
No, the coffee does that now.
Yeah. Well, I'm up for about 5 coffees tomorrow morning, but you know why. Okay, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Frank Howell, K4FMH.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me, Martin.
Yeah, great to have you as always, Frank, and always fun. And last but not least, Mr. Leslie Butterfield. We will say good night.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to be back on again, Martin, and hello to everyone. It's great to be back. And where did I leave my marathon?
Probably in your back pocket, Leslie. It'll be horrible now. Oh dear. Thanks, Leslie, for joining us tonight. Okay, all that's left for me to do now is say 73, so move on to the next part of the podcast. 73, guys.
Cheerio.
73.
Keep your amateur ham radio podcast advert free by donating less than a length of coax. Visit www.icqpodcast.com/donate now. For all the news, links and information, visit www.icqpodcast.com.
And now it's time to have a look at the news in brief with me, Colin M6BOY. Next weekend, after this episode is released, is St. Patrick's Day, and the annual festivity of being very Irish is celebrated on the 17th of March. But this year, we're expecting special event stations to be on the air longer, as the Irish government has announced a 2-day festival break, concluding the 18th of March, as giving an extra day off for people who, as they worked so hard during the COVID pandemic. So do expect special event stations to start from the midnight on the 16th and through to the 18th, as people have extra time to keep these stations on the air. As always, as you'd expect, everything Irish will be encouraged and, as I've spoken about during this event. And again, not only is there special event stations going to be available, but there's also an award as well. So you can find out more by visiting www.stpatricksaward.com for more information. The ARRL has reported on a Barbados ham who is among one of the oldest in the world. Winston A. Woody Richardson, who goes by the call sign of 8 Papa 6 Charlie Charlie, has just turned 107 years of age, and so he's believed to be one of the oldest hams that we have. We got lots of activities that he's been involved in. He's been a big DXer and a contester in his day, and the Woody Richardson Communication Room is part of the Amateur Radio Society of Barbados, as they've named that in his honour there. So fantastic, fantastic recognition of a fellow ham, aged 107 years of age. Right, we're going to head over to our features episode, and it's our feature on amateur radio resources. As always, we hope you enjoy.
And now, what you've all been waiting for, this episode's feature from the ICQ podcast. Hi guys, for this episode I wanted to talk about a few things I've found on the internet, and that's why I called it more good free radio information. So, if you're anything like me, I sit in front of a computer at times and I think, I wonder about this, and then I go off and have a look, and then I wonder about something else, and I go off and have a look, and I kind of keep improving my knowledge on this hobby, and the more I spend looking and learning, the more I realise, in all honesty, just how little I really do know. And I think that's a fair statement for all of us. However, there is some really good information out on the internet, there's some really bad information out on the internet. And I cringe every time I see some of these guys soldering on the internet and think, you shouldn't be allowed to have a soldering iron. But that's another story. Anyway, let's tell you what I found and some useful resources you may enjoy to have a look at. Now, I was looking up about grounding and bonding my shack and how I should do it. And there are a number of YouTube videos out there and obviously some good documentation. But the one I came across, I think, is worth us having a look at. It's not amateur radio. The document was written by Motorola, and it talks about communication sites and how they earthen a communication site. Well, it's all about the whole, how they put it in. But there are a couple of chapters on earthing, bonding of equipment and racks and all those sort of things, and antennas, with some really, really good drawings as well. So, there's some good drawings which really emphasise what's going on. Now, I was really impressed with this, and I think I'm going to probably use some of this stuff as we go forward. The next one I came across, and let's be honest about it, it's an ARRL publication. I don't think it's in print at the moment, and if you're at a rally, you might want to pick it up if you spot it. But it was called Vintage Radio, ARRL's Vintage Radio. And I've spent far too long looking at this. It's a great book. It shows how things were done in the past. some really interesting articles. So, in fairness, just sometimes it's worth knowing how we got to where we are now so that you can understand as things go forward. This is a great publication, well worth downloading and having a look at if you get the time. Now, for some of us, we obviously have been in the hobby a long time. For others, it's a fairly short time. And in fairness, although I did my qualifications years ago as a service engineer on valve technology, or tube technology as they call it in the States, that was pretty much the last year they were teaching tube technology, around about 1974, 75, something like that, in the UK. So, in fairness, some people don't know how they work, and they look and they worry. Now, often you will find at rallies, ARRL handbooks, old ones, and I've got quite a few going back over the years. But online, I found the 1959 ARRL handbook. So that's 62 years, 63 years old? And lots of interesting tube information in there. Well worth a look. I'll put a link in the show notes for you for all of these things. Going forward over the last 2 years, we've also had a lot of people that have come into our hobby. And in fairness, they've done it remotely. They've done online training. They've done all sorts of bits and pieces. But unless you are around hams and you talk to them regularly, some things are a bit worrying because you're struggling to understand what's going on. So, looking back at some of the other books that are available, that might very well help you. I came across the Beginner's Handbook to Amateur Radio. Interesting book, might fill in some gaps, and I hope that helps a few people along the way. And the last one, Alex Discovers Amateur Radio. Now, this is not so much a book, but a comic that you can download off the internet. I found this on the Icon website originally. There's a colour version, which I'm going to give you the URL to in the show notes. And the thing with this is it's aimed at the younger members of amateur radio, the people that are coming in. So, for argument's sake, if you've got children or grandchildren like I have that start asking you about what this amateur radio stuff is and why you're shut away in your shack, this could be a very, very good little document to give them. Let them have a look at it. Talk it through with them. Go through it with them. And there's also some question and answer sessions in there, so to check that they understood what they got. So it's not a hard learn, but it could be just enough to get grandchildren and the likes involved. Now, I know this is only a short feature, but in fairness, if you spend half as long looking at some of these 5 items that I'm suggesting, you won't need much more than 5 minutes. Okay, I hope this was of interest.
Well, as always, we hope our features episode has just whetted your appetite to finding more information about our wonderful hobby. And we'll put those links, etc., on the ICQ podcast webpage so you can, find out more from the show page of how to find those links. So just check out icqpodcast.com for those links. Right, we've got a bit of feedback this episode to have a think and a chat about. So first one is from Robert, Mike 0, Romeo Whiskey X-Ray. And he says, hi, he says, something that's been bothering for a while. He's a keen SOTA activator. And in January earlier this year, whilst activating GW/SW/014, was contacted by an M7 station, asked if I was operating near a certain landmark as the operator had worked there previously. I stated my location, gave the operator a signal report. As there was no exchange in return, they said I requested a signal report. The operator responded that this had not been taught and therefore did not know what to do. I kindly suggested for the operator to find out how to conduct a QSO and how to exchange call signs and signal reports, perhaps by checking YouTube. There was no answer, and when I checked if the operator was still on frequency, sadly there was no response. Is this a one-off, or did the UK during the pandemic licensing of many hundreds of operators are unable to contact a QSO and therefore shortly or already have left the hobby? So Robert asks, obviously, for our thoughts, and I know obviously your dad as a trainer and a very seasoned trainer for many years in the amateur radio hobby. I suppose you're probably best placed to answer Robert's query in relation to this potential problem of a lot of M7s out there who may haven't had any physical training on how to actually operate and conduct a QSO.
Yeah, I'm often very vocal on this subject. In fact, I was actually in the news roundtable at one part because there was something very similar happened. But in fairness, Robert, yes, I understand there are a lot of people come into the hobby. It is daunting and let's face it, pretty much everybody and their dog is microphone shy when they pick up the microphone for the first time. Now, it was bad enough when they had to do the practicals for the foundation and people were so mic shy, but at least they sat down with an amateur and he went through and he explained what a QSL is and how to conduct yourself and all those sort of bits and pieces. The downside, unfortunately, is we know practicals now. These guys are not 100% sure. So you've literally, when you find one online, you've literally got to drop out of amateur radio and go back into just talking to them in plain English and then try and explain to them what you want from them and help them through. The problem is, I think, that a lot of new amateurs who have joined the hobby must or really ought to go find a club, sit down with some amateurs at the club meetings or whatever, operate under supervision, all those sort of things that help you get started. And I think now that restrictions are being lifted, guys, if you got a license while you were in lockdown, please come and talk to us. 99% of all amateurs would be more than willing to help you. So, yeah, sorry, Robert. He probably just didn't understand and he went into panic mode. And it's a real shame. And I hope we don't lose the majority of the people we pulled into the hobby because they've got a license, but they don't know how to use it. So that's the problem, I think, Colin.
Yeah, certainly a potential problem, but I suppose it's all of our responsibilities as well in all these things to try as best we can to say educate and inform, and say help the amateur along. So as I say, I'll be fair play to you for trying there, Robert, to educate. But certainly, it's also I think could be very good as well for trying to get the people along to maybe a local club or something along those lines that might also be able to help them out. So let's hope, as say these M7s coming on stream in the UK and maybe also other hams as well coming on around the world that say we do our best to nurture them into the hobby and not lose this tranche of new people that say we certainly have. The next bit of feedback is from Pat, Whiskey 5 Whiskey Tango Hotel. And he asks, is there a Ham Shack hotline extension that would get me into the ICQ DMR channel? Well, first off, let's ask the question that some people might be hoping we ask, which is a Ham Shack hotline. And what is it? And as I say, could that be used?
Right, Colin. Well, Ham Shack hotline initially is a VoIP or voice over IP internet network protocol for connecting phones. It's a free service available to ham radio operators only worldwide, and you effectively connect a voice over IP phone onto their network. Now, if you've got a Cisco phone, an old Cisco phone, that's pretty much going to make your life very easy because they will pretty much provision it for you. If you've got one of their preferred phones, you just send them a short note and they'll then program your phone to do what it should be on their network. Unfortunately, if you're like me and don't have a preferred phone, you can still do this. They'll send you the information and you have to provision your own phone onto the network. So what I can do is I can pick up the phone and I can phone somebody else worldwide who's an amateur who wants to talk to me. Now, often I'm sitting in the shack and the phone will go and listeners will talk to me. And in fairness, guys, if you're ringing me and I'm in the shack, I'll talk to you. If you ring me and I'm not in the shack, then unfortunately, it's probably going to go to voicemail. And there you go. Now, this question about is the ICQ DMR group going to be on Ham Shack Hotline? I would suggest at this point in time, we have no plans to do this. In reality, if you only want to listen to what's going on the DMR group, then use Brandmeister's Hotline product. And it's on our website. If you go to the digital group, scroll down, you'll find a link to the Hotline, which does exactly what you're asking us to do. That's internet across the internet to a computer, comes out your speakers instead of a voice connected phone. So in reality, Pat, right this moment in time, no plans to do it. But equally, if you feel bored one day, and I think I've actually worked you on Ham Shack Hotline, but any of you out there, if you're bored one day and it's a bit quiet, I'm more than willing to take a call on the phone if I'm in the shack. So there you go, Colin.
Exactly so. And the good thing is with, say, that system, as long as in the shack, he doesn't have to have his mobile phone charged, is what I found out this week. So, so that's the good sign. As you're more likely to catch him that way. Now, I'd say if you want to have your question answered on anything you listen to the show, is way doing that is visit our website, icqpodcast.com, click on the contact us section and pop us a mail. And as I say, we'll do our best to answer any queries. While you're there, you also may consider showing the value you receive from our fine show by supporting us and sending in a donation our way to help us out with our running costs. This episode, along with our monthly subscription donors, Walter KT0 Delta and Patrick Whiskey Mike 2 Alpha are our kind donors who help support us out. But as I say, most importantly, guys, is if you found some interest in our show, best thing I can suggest you do is turn that into a monetary value of the value you got from us, and say take up one of the options or make up your own, and say and send away. And everything you send our way helps keeps advert free and keeps us producing your amateur radio show here on the internet for you. So we'd really suggest you go along and check those things out. Well, we'd better thank our kind colleagues as well who help make this show happen by joining us on the News Roundtable and giving us their thoughts and opinions on what's going on in the hobby. So we'd like to thank Chris, Mike 0, Tango Charlie Hotel, Martin, Mike 0, Sierra Golf Lima, Frank, Kilo 4, Foxtrot Mike Hotel, and Leslie, Golf 0, Charlie India Bravo for taking part in the News Roundtable. So many thanks, guys, for taking part with us there. Right, well, I think that just about, wraps up everything for this episode number 372 of the ICQ podcast. And now the most important thing I can ask you to do, Dad, is to make sure you look after Mum for me, make her a cup of tea, and maybe sort out a little treat to go with that as well.
Yeah, certainly can do, Colin. I'm going to find your mum a cup of tea, as you say, always. And, find a jockey, Becky. For those who are interested, there are some updated stats on our website regarding the digital group. We're now at 42 countries in a year, which I think is pretty good. And we pulled another 11 new listeners in or users in last month. So all being all, I'll leave you in peace, Colin, while I go off and make Mum that cup of tea.
Wonderful. Well, as I say, guys, we'll catch you in a fortnight's time. 73's all.